Welcome to the LSI Behind the Wind podcast. I'm Lauren Lane. For 50 years now, the LSI team has dedicated themselves to the science of business development. We've seen the impact of our work and how it's evolved into economic development and now social impact work. This week, Sean and Josh Johnson, LSI's VP of Economic Development, have a follow-up discussion on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as IIJA, and what individuals and organizations need to do to get access to that funding right now. We're about a year into the infrastructure law being signed by the president, and there is a lot that has been done and a lot more that is still to come. Notifications of funding opportunities are frequently being released, so if you have been considering getting going, now is the time to do so. Let's dive in with Sean and Josh.
Hey, Josh, thanks for joining me on this episode. It's been a few months since we have talked about IIJA, and although our team has been entrenched in this IIJA work and working with a lot of various federal, state, municipal entities, but I thought it'd be a good idea as we enter into the new fiscal year, what should these organizations be considering as we enter into the new 2023 fiscal year, and what is the status? So, like I said, I appreciate you being with me on this episode to talk about anything that you're hearing from your contacts within the agencies.
Yeah, so it's been a really good year so far. What we have seen, though, the challenge continues that the turn times on these are very quick, this funding, and a lot of communities are just not prepared. And those that are, even if they're prepared and know it's coming along, still don't have that internal capability to write to these. And a case in point is this issue of how do you have a technical project, which then requires a whole nother section dealing with how you're addressing these Justice 40 initiatives that are prioritizing these projects. And it's really taken a lot of communities back, a lot of entities back, that even if they have a good technical approach, they still are having challenges writing to the requirements, and many aren't even addressing it like they should, which, as you're fully aware, many of these entities are disqualifying themselves just because of what they consider a simple component, which is, in this case, a major component in these proposals.
So just backing up, IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, was passed last Thanksgiving by the Congress, signed by the president the last week in November of last year. The first quarter was really the administration and the agencies working through the criteria for awarding this funding to primarily states and municipalities on both formula and competitive grants. And as part of the criteria, the Justice 40, which is one of the primary quantitative elements of IIJA, is that 40% of the funding needs to benefit disenfranchised communities, and not just communities, right? It's disenfranchised demographics. I mean, can you just spend 2 minutes talking about that element of this?
Sure. So what's interesting about this Justice 40 initiative, it's spread across the variety of areas. So some people think that it's this diversity component, which is important in it, but it's got a variety of other things. And what we're finding, that disadvantaged communities generally are those that have been left behind for a variety of reasons, or actually build over for other reasons. And so what we consider whenever we look at these, there are generally about 8 characteristics that are from, and I highlight them: climate change, the impacts in that community with what may be happening with climate, what's happening currently with clean energy and energy efficiency within the community. Do they have clean transit? Is there housing that's sustainable? Is there legacy pollution? These are just some of the things, as well as some of the things that we don't normally think about. Is this a community that's got health burdens, that they might have high levels of different types of sicknesses that are approaching these communities. And all of these are aspects of what are found within the Justice 40 initiative. And so as we look at this, we're having to map communities that are going after opportunities that don't seem to address the health burden, but the way that these are written, we write in specifically how we're improving the situation within the communities in which we are advocating, or I should say, doing their strategy and writing these grants.
Yeah. So we had a client this past week that had some confusion on this. It's not that, I think a lot of these government contractors have this idea that it's an 8A type initiative where 40% of the work must go to an 8A type entity or a disenfranchised community. That's not the case. I mean, it is that 40% of the funding must benefit disenfranchised demographics. So there's a lot of scope there and a broad spectrum that where I believe that both public and private entities can show that the project is benefiting a disenfranchised demographic. Do you agree?
Yeah, and what's interesting is you could have a city that everybody believes is doing well, and when you start narrowing into just the several block range, there are mapping techniques that we're using that are actually showing how that community is impacted with A, B, C, D, whatever it might be. And so all of a sudden, there's a qualification even in an area where people think everything's going well. And this is happening across the country in every city, whether the economy is doing well or not. There are these islands occurring, and they do have priorities, these communities that have these islands within them to go after this funding. And in some cases, it's even at the matching funds are even less when you're addressing these directly, which they should be. We don't want to continue to not allow these communities to advance because they can't pay for a match. And so our team has done a lot of good work in making sure that the funding is available, but they can go after it without having to do a federal match, because in many cases they've been disenfranchised and can't even afford that.
All right, appreciate that. So I mean, the timeline on this, as I said, in November of last year, the Congress came together, the House and Senate passed the bill, initially the IIJA bill and then act, and sent it to the White House. The president signed the bill it was the last week in November. It was right before December. Spent 3 months putting together this, the White House guide to what then became the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And then when the funding was finally pushed to the agencies this spring, it started trickling into the agencies April, right? If I remember right. And you remember when we were meeting with transportation, health and human services, energy, DOD, when our team was embedded in each of these entities, there was a lot of urgency, and everybody said, we're going to have by the 4th of July, we're going to have everything out. We're going to have all of our RFPs out. Many of these agencies have pulled back. Tell me your thoughts on this. I mean, I've got some ideas, but I'd like to know your thoughts on, there was such urgency early on, and of the $1.6 trillion appropriated and dispersed to the agencies, there's only been a fraction that has been actually pushed. A lot of the formula grants have been pushed, but I mean, there's still a lot of IIJA funding that's sitting there. What has created this delay in the agencies committing to this funding?
So I think you raise a very good point. And what has happened with this a lot of these agencies aren't grant making entities. They are entities that are given an allocation that then is sent to the states, where the states then are through formula allocating that funding. So what this Congress and this administration has said is, let's turn these federal agencies now into actual grant making entities that people need to go to them to go compete for that funding. So what you have is this whole process of sending money to states through formulas, usual process, but it that's so embedded in legislation and congressional intent that the administration was not able to incorporate what they consider important to have. So what they are doing is actually creating, how do we manage multi-billion-dollar grants where before we were doing multi-million or multi-$100,000 grants. Now we're having these folks who've never had experience managing specific individual grants. They've managed formula grants and been able to tell the state how to report these. But now you're asking these folks, in some cases, fairly junior in agencies, to be able to develop requirements and guidance to push out grants that a recipient could get in the $100+ million range. So it's a fascinating thing, and I think it's surprised a lot of people who were thinking, oh yeah, we can easily spend this money. Well, when you have to start to think about how the process of spending dollars are, the oversight of it, that people started to pull back a little, and that if we don't do this right, then 6 months later, after it's allocated, we're going to have the IGs or different entities coming in and saying, why did you do it this way? And you're not really, you don't really have any rules in place. And so the good about that is there's a sense of, we need to understand how we're doing it, what we're doing. But every agency is different. So if you're applying for a Department of Energy grant, where before they didn't have this type of money, it's going to be very different than you're applying for a grant through EPA. Same thing. They're developing these requirements and guidance. And in fact, we're writing a grant right now in which it basically is countering provisions in it, because what you've had is a junior administration staffer who is cutting and pasting from areas. And so they're loading up some of these grant applications with 50, 60 requirements that they think, oh, this sounds good, let's put it in there. What's the problem with that is these grants are 30 pages long. So in order to meet these requirements, you're going to say what, one or two sentences for each requirement. So that's a challenge that people are coming to us all the time, and they'll say, look, requirement number 6, it contradicts requirement number 18. Yeah. And so, these are things in which they're starting to understand are a little more complicated than saying we believe in the environment or we believe in helping those less disenfranchised. They are starting to think, how do we deliver in a way that they get what they need? And it's, the deliverables, we can come back and understand what was done.
So there has been some awards early on, and you can augment this. Early on, I think some of the first RFPs released and grants awarded were the airport infrastructure, which was a few $1 billion. Broadband, I know there were some other projects that were released in between, but broadband seemed like the next big push. So there's a lot of the buckets of funding that we have talked about on previous episodes that still have not we haven't even seen a pre-RFP or any kind of notice at all, that things that we've been waiting for and that really comprise a lot of the law of the funding. Water infrastructure, we really have not seen any of that be released. The energy, a lot of the energy grants have not been pushed. All the EPA, the carbon emission reduction, transportation, clean hydrogen, all of those buckets that we had talked about still have yet to be pushed by the agencies.
Yeah, no, that is the case. I mean, you have all this funding looking at how do you reduce, reuse, and recycle batteries. So we're promoting this, that we want everybody to turn to battery for their cars, but we have provisions that were passed to address, well, what do you do when all of a sudden we have all these batteries and cars? And how do you recycle it? What is the best approach to take? So in some cases, it's kind of things that are going out first could have some challenges when they technically see later how do we resolve certain issues that may be causing some challenges. And there's also a variety of things with remediation for water, soil, solid waste, et cetera. So you're correct that there are a lot of things that are really beneficial to communities across the country that are still in the staging and asking for, in some cases, comments.
And I think the big transportation infrastructure funding, I mean, there's a lot of technical elements of these projects, the roads, bridges, freight, rail, ports and waterway, the transportation bucket that we had talked about, including electric vehicles, the EV projects. There is just a lot of technical elements to this, which I think initially there was this urgency to just put anything out, have industry respond, or have the states and municipalities respond, and they've sort of pulled back on that now. In addition to just the bandwidth of a lot of these organizations in their ability to commit this funding, and we hear a lot of these organizations are hiring hundreds of new people just to administer and work the reporting on these projects. We had heard that the administration and the Congress both wanted this funding obligated by tomorrow, right? By the 30th of September 2022. That then was pushed out to September 30th, 2023. And we've even heard that there may be some waivers beyond 2023. Have you heard anything about the obligation of the funding? I mean, it just seems like as the reality sets in on how big of a project this is, that a lot of the agencies are saying this is impossible.
Yeah, I think you're correct on that. We'll see what Congress does. Some of this is instilled within annual appropriations processes that Congress does, that is funding's embedded in that. Even though it's allocated for this, there are certain requirements that need to have Congress act and pass its own appropriations laws, which they're struggling to move through as we speak. I do think that, once they get through this election cycle, they'll figure out where things are at. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about who should be the power of the purse. Is it the administration getting a blank check, or should Congress do that? Are we spending it the right way or not? And so those are questions in which have held up some of this going forward. But what's been interesting is a lot of communities are waiting for things to come out, and we are finding that in one case, we were initially working with an entity, and they said, well, let's just hold off for a bit. And they came forward a little while ago and said, we want to go after this now. And the comment was, in order to compete for this, you have to have a safety plan. So they disqualified themselves because they took so long to wait to figure out they actually did want. In this case, it was safe streets. It was sidewalks and safety for kids and pedestrians and bikers. So a safety plan's a simple thing to do, but they couldn't compete for this. Because they had not developed that. So the best that they could do was ask for some money for that. Well, what that's likely going to do is the next year, is there going to be funding for them to now ask for it? Probably not. And so a lot of these things are, in order to get the funding, there has to be some preliminary work done. And our team has been doing great work on making sure that, as we know things are going to be coming forward in 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, that they get in place at what we know will be the required documentation. So they can actually compete for the millions coming out.
Exactly. And we are working with so many of these communities. I'm excited about working with these communities that are committed to going after this funding and that have a real strategy. And just to backtrack a little bit, talk about the command center concept that we have set up in a lot of these organizations and embedded in these communities.
So as we see periodically, we have these massive natural disasters that occur, and we're seeing one at this time of year and the latter part of 2022 with the storm hitting Florida. So when a storm is going to hit, you have a what we call a command center that's put into place, and the Corps of Engineers does it well, FEMA does it well, Department of Defense, of course, does it all the time. Why we like these are not the storms, but we like to know what is going to occur and how do you address what the needs will be. And so think of this command center not for purposes of total destruction, sadly, which we're seeing, but what do you do when you recognize there's a lot of funding actually to address challenges that may arise in the future with natural disasters, but as importantly, all the pots of funding that there may be there. So as command center would basically be, you'd have one person. Well, what we have is one person that's coordinating at the so-called command center with eyes across all the agencies and funding, so that where in some of these cases you're going to have one funding agency have to do something in order for another one to fund it. So the role of this command center is to act quickly, act in a manner in which is looking at the big vision of the community as a whole, and to ensure that they're compliant in getting the funding. And going back to the storm scenario, within this legislation, there are a variety of provisions, or in the Infrastructure Act, dealing with how do you make things more resilient? What happens when a fire goes through a community and takes down, 10 miles of power lines? Well, they're out of power. Well, what does that mean for the community? Well, we should go get a generator. We need to island it off. We need to do this and that. So a lot of the funding right now in the infrastructure law that we're working with communities on is addressing how do you make communities more resilient in times where climate's changing, where natural disasters, when they hit, they're in many cases stronger than what we had anticipated. And so just keep that in mind that I'm using the scenario of a command center for a natural disaster, but a lot of this funding is for purposes to ensure that communities are prepared for their growth, for the people in the community that are less fortunate, that they can meet the infrastructure needs that are deteriorating, and that they can meet the needs of the next 20 to 50 years for climate-related issues that we have found ourselves in.
So the midterm elections coming up in a few weeks, I've heard a lot of communities, some of our big clients are saying we want to wait until after the election. I think that's the wrong approach. I just do not see that there's going to be a lot of changes in the direction. I mean, the funding's already been pushed. It's not, I just do not see that there's going to be new or a different strategy for obligating this funding regardless of what happens in the midterm. I mean, can you talk about that for a minute and your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree that there's not going to be much change moving ahead. I know there's conversations about if the party changes, this or that will happen. But as you've described, this is a statute put in place, and a lot has been done to fortify the funding streams and the policies moving ahead. One thing that's interesting, and I'm going to kind of jump to a practice that hasn't occurred for years, is in the Congress, they used to do what they call earmarks or direct spending for constituencies. In many cases, they're public entities. Over the past 2 years, they brought that back. And you'll have members saying, I'm so happy I secured, $3 million for 10 projects in my district. And then we're seeing coming out of the administration from this law that they just passed, you're having agencies say, we are so pleased to help this constituency and give them $50 million. So it's kind of ironic that so often people are looking at DC as, let's go get an earmark for this. Right. Where we have found ourselves is that the best opportunities for getting the funding that you need is right out there now. You just have to have that bandwidth to go after these competitive opportunities and also know how to write to them. And it's a challenge. But it's just fascinating, these releases going out from the congressional delegations about $500,000 here, $1 million there. And then we're seeing $1 billion this day, another $100 million the next day from different agencies in the government who are doing basically earmarks with this funding that's going out in the competitive grants.
So I mean, not surprising to most people in this business that it is being politicized, especially during the pending midterm elections. So just be aware of that. Try to sift through what is political rhetoric and what is facts. We're working with a lot of communities and doing a lot of multifaceted programs. I mean, what are some of the projects that you're really excited about that our team's working under IIJA?
So a few that are interesting are we're working with several different tribal entities who, as many are aware, for centuries have continually been said we shouldn't have done what occurred. And we want to fix it. Well, what's interesting with this funding is a lot of these tribal entities now are doing projects which not only are benefiting them, but they're large scale and they're benefiting the communities adjacent to them. So you have a really interesting, the work we're doing is really interesting, in which the tribal entities are helping out the regions where either their lands are or where the tribal members are. So I find that fascinating. And these are everything from helping with cities' transportation projects that are adjacent to some of these tribal lands, as well as some of the broadband funding that is helping some of the disenfranchised folks who may be living in areas where it is not. But by leveraging the tribes actually taking the lead on this, it's helping improve the situations of many, many folks. We're also finding that, in order to win this stuff, that you have to have the bandwidth. And so there's some creative things going on in which folks, submeans or foundations that care about different types of audiences can help pay for that funding to get the grant writers in place to write and win. So you think about it from this perspective. Let's say I'm a foundation who cares about children's safety in schools, and I'm giving out, $50,000 for this initiative, $100,000 for that, or $1 million for this. In this case, you could be going, paying for not a lot to do the writing of these opportunities that are being granted that could totally be in the several million or $100 million range. And so I think that there's been some really creative thinking out there of how do you get these people to write. The last thing I want to say on that what it's coming down to, the challenges communities have, is they do not have bandwidth. You talk to them and they say, oh, we got a grant writer. And that grant writer is there, yes, but that grant writer is managing potentially their formula grants. They're managing a grant that they won 2 years ago and doing the deliverables, but they do not have the bandwidth to write. And even if they write additionally, but even if they did, these grants are so different than any grant we've seen. Definitely. When you're talking about, give me your technical on how you're going to build the freeway, but I also want to know why that freeway is important to meet the health concerns, environmental concerns, the remediation concerns, the safety concerns of all these folks that live in the region who are disenfranchised, that are, within the project, not even necessarily even in the project area. It could be larger than that. And there's that capacity. We have found that the creativity needed for that is just not there. And so I think a lot of our success has been, that lesson learned has been having a lot of creatives who are writing to meet the requirements that are very unique.
It's fun working with some of these communities that have had vision and had a strong strategy and just not the funding. And we're working with a fantastic community that really fits that definition that for 100 years, it's been one of the poorest areas of the United States. And I've just been impressed with this group and how visionary that they are in saying this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to capture infrastructure funding that they'd never be able to fund. And for our team, under this command center concept, interfacing with the Department of Transportation and EPA and Energy and Commerce and all of these various organizations, it's tremendous. And it's a lot of fun. I mean, it's really, we've got such creative people working on these engagements that are connecting the dots across multiple projects, across multiple entities, and linking together a project that might be a Department of Commerce priority to a Department of Transportation or a Department of Energy priority. So it's Lauren and I talked. We did a recording some time ago and just talked about if you want to see LSI's, all of the LSI methodology in action, look at these ecosystems where we're pulling together capture, proposal, program execution, the economic development, the social impact and job creation. It's fun to see this in action, and it's so convoluted. So, a couple things. I think it's interesting that, we still have not seen the big ticket funding come out. A lot of the roads, bridges, and infrastructure projects we still haven't seen. And I think, as we said, a lot of it is bandwidth within the agencies, but also that it is technical and they want to make sure it's correct. We've seen very little water come out yet, so that's still yet to come. Some of the things like resilience, clean energy, the remediation projects still have not been released. Ports and waterways, transportation. There's still a lot of funding that has not even surfaced at all. And so, talk about how these communities can prepare and be ready when the RFPs drop and that funding's ready to be pushed.
Yeah, I think you described it well. We're talking over $1 trillion of funding that we know is coming out. We know that a third to a bit more is going to be competitive, meaning that you have to do something to get it. And that's where I think the challenge has been with so many communities across the country is they're getting additional funding to build out some of the infrastructure that they had planned. But there is so much more that could tie into their infrastructure plan if they thought a little more creatively and went after these additional pots of money, but they can't. They have limitations on what the bandwidth internally. So I think that how I would work it with communities is doing what I mentioned on this core community that wanted to get some safety pieces in play, the sidewalks, the bike trails, etc. And they couldn't because they did not do one simple step. And to me, if I'm a community out there, I would be looking and saying, guys, I know this funding's coming forward at some point. Can you help develop what we know we'll need to have, even though the requirements are still going to be refined? What are the basic things we need? And a lot of these are pretty simple. Some of them require some more technical engineering to be put in place. But at the cost of doing that to what can be done and doing it now rather than waiting means that those projects that before would have been a few $100,000 to plan out now are in the tens of millions to actually construct. So I just know that this is actually a good thing right now, that although we've seen billions of dollars leave this year, we're going to see hundreds of billions of dollars leave over the next little bit. So, there's just so much out there that communities just need to actually, get. I'll give you one last example. We did what we call an opportunity pipeline for. In this case, it was a company that provides power, which of course for an economy is needed. And they wanted us to come in and identify what are the things that they can go after. Well, when we did this, we realized there were, a couple handfuls of immediate things they could go after. But there were literally hundreds of opportunities, not just tied to the infrastructure law, but that are out there every day that could be tied to that. It wouldn't be a utility winning it. It would be some other entity that wins it, that actually helps build upon what the utility and the power is to be used for. So, I mean, it really is as creative as folks can be. It just takes them to actually act. And I just think right now when we're waiting for this over the next couple months, as a lot of these are going to be dropping, it's time for communities to act.
As we wrap up this discussion, which I think that our team is so entrenched in this, stepping back and looking at, okay, this is really what's still yet to come. It is remarkable. It is. We haven't even hit half of the funding obligation yet, not even close. So there's a lot left to do. But one of the things that we have not discussed is these ancillary bills that have been passed that are, they're really tangent to the IIJA. And the inflation, is it the Inflation Reduction Act, right? The CHIPS Act. And these are huge funds. Can you just give a brief overview of some of these follow-on pieces of legislation that we weren't really anticipating and just followed in the wake of IIJA?
Sure. So we have to remember a lot of times when legislation's passed, it's what can they muster the vote to get out at a certain time. So you've seen with a lot of the COVID monies that they had different bills moving throughout the year. One, they would have liked to have done it, the Congress altogether, but you can only do so much before you have enough folks who are pulling, this issue or that issue out. So with the Infrastructure Act, it was just a follow-up. In this case, it's public infrastructure, and infrastructure in general is good. And these are the directives of where we want to go. And so that passed. Then you had this Inflation Reduction Act. You have a push by folks saying, I can't make it day to day. And so Congress says, okay, let's figure out ways to lower health costs, or energy bills or Medicare, whatever it might be. Oh, but by the way, we didn't add all the things we wanted to under the Infrastructure Act. So we're going to put another, $500 million, in this case, close to $500 billion to do energy security and climate change, Western drought resiliency. And you can start to see that a component that should have been part of the Infrastructure Act now is part of the Inflation Reduction Act. Right. And then you get going, even following up on that, the recently passed bill to deal with chips manufacturing in the United States. Think about the United States right now, to try to buy a car, you can't. There are tens of thousands of cars sitting in lots. They look brand new, everything's brand new, but they don't have that little chip. And so people cannot buy the car because our incapacity to manufacture in the United States, as well as even abroad, chips. So Congress came into the picture again and says, well, cars are more expensive, phones are more expensive, everything that requires chips are more expensive, and we don't have them. So they passed legislation in this case saying we need to build more factories and supply chain initiatives to ensure that we in the United States can do this. And so that's led to an additional $50 billion more. And so you're going to continue to see these things go forward. But what's interesting is that, again, is money going to, in the case of the chips, to the Department of Commerce, who has not run $50 billion grant programs that are going to be competitively driven. So the same challenge that we're seeing with the infrastructure law is happening on all these provisions. We're again granting, the Congress is saying, for whatever reason, we think that the Department of Commerce can manage a $60 billion earmark better than Congress. And they may be able to. Not, I mean, that's, but at the same point, there's no legislative real direction per se, other than this. And then the people at Commerce are going to have to, over the next 18 months, they're going to have to figure out how are we going to create a program that gets chip processing in the United States and ensures a supply chain. So you have very smart people sitting in the administration right now developing requirements for multi-billion-dollar programs that they've never run. And so it's great in many ways because we're addressing the needs that we've had in the United States for decades. But the challenge will be those who can, how is it going to impact those who can least afford it? But also, how do you get people to write and win this work, which is going to be competitively driven, not just send out in, formulas to states?
I think that the initial funding for CHIPS was $50 billion, and it is quadrupled in size now, up to almost $250 billion. That had and it's multiple elements to this, but you're right. I mean, it is staggering the amount of money that's going into this, and that's getting a lot of attention because of the demand for semiconductor technology that's domestic and the supply chains that are broken, but there are some other smaller supply chain projects coming out of Commerce and some of the other agencies that I think are really exciting as well. And what I find so interesting about this is that there's a lot of consideration by the agencies in looking at funding projects that they haven't thought of yet. So being creative as a community, as a state entity, or even as a private or nonprofit entity, if you can get creative and really articulate what it is that you want funded, whatever that is, whatever that looks like, and that we can write a story around that, it's likely going to get funded.
Yeah, I like that, Sean, really quick, the story. The nice thing about what they're doing actually is it's no longer the day I can pour cement and build this. They're saying, I know you can pour cement and do this, but what does that actually mean for where you're pouring cement? Not just for the car that's going to travel on that, but what is the story that's tied to why we should care about that project? And in many cases, we've forgotten that there's a lot of constituencies that should care about something that are not at the table when something is planned. And we've seen that in a lot of the low-income communities across the country, particularly when we built the highway systems, interstate highways. You when you're driving through major cities nowadays, you look to the side, there's people living under there. And they've lived in a manner, in a way that we didn't think about when we were building these systems. And now this, with the Infrastructure Act, there are provisions that are saying, okay, you put this freeway right through this community. They can't get on the freeway. They can't get off the freeway here. And it's also right next to all the other things that you didn't want to have put into other communities is all here. We need to think about us, meaning those that live in those areas, as well as the benefits that others are receiving. So it does have a lot of, I think, community benefits that in the long term are actually really good policy directives.
Agreed. And just one final plug for these tribal projects. You and I both are passionate about the working with tribal entities. And can you just talk for a minute on why a community should consider bringing a tribal nation or some tribal entity into these discussions? This has been a central part of our IIJA strategy from the beginning, and it goes back over 30 years of LSI's tribal approach. But could you talk about, if you're a community, even a large, we're working with a community that's one of the largest, most affluent communities in America. I mean, it's interesting that we're working, I guess I didn't think about that until now. We've got, on the one side, one of the most affluent communities in America that we're working with, and one of the most impoverished communities in America that we're working with per capita. I mean, so if you are a community that is considering pursuing funding, IIJA, or some of the ancillary policy and bills that are in the wake of IIJA, why should you care? Why should you consider bringing in a tribal entity to work with you?
Yeah, I really like this policy in that so often we say, oh, by the way, we have tribes are eligible for this. In this case, this legislation comes straight out and says, look, tribes, you're prioritized in this. You not only do you have a specific amount that only tribes can go after, we are also in all the competitive funding. You have a precedent that because you are, in light of how the administration cages this, a disenfranchised community, you have priority to win this competitive grant above others who are communities of more means. What's interesting as well is that they've taken off the matches on a lot of these. So where before a community would have to put up 25%, in this case, if a tribal entity wins a competitive grant, a lot of times these matching funds are not there. So you have what is interesting, the tribes now being able to come in and say, guys, we're all in this together as a community. In this case, we can prime this because it does impact directly what we need, but the benefits are to the region as a whole. So I really like the tribal play in this because we're all in the boat together, but we've somehow lost the sight over the years that, there's tribal entities that are there or here. Now we're all together, and what benefits the tribal nation is also in many cases with what they're doing, benefiting their adjacent communities, which also benefit because of the way that the law is prioritizing different types of communities.
Even communities that have forgotten that, this is the ancestral lands of a tribal entity, bringing that tribe back in, or a tribe back in, and partnering with the tribe or with a tribal entity is just going to strengthen your case for this funding. I can't overemphasize how much attention that the tribes are receiving in a lot of these grants. So consider that as part of the strategy as you put together your IIJA roadmap. All right, well, this has been great. Josh, I appreciate your insight and updates on IIJA, and appreciate the work with you and your team on working with these communities across the U.S. It's just been a lot of fun, and I love to see some of these communities finally being able to fund these major projects that they have had a vision for years.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.